When I speak of collapse, I do not refer merely to a crumbling of outward appearances, nor to the visible breakdown of the narcissist's carefully constructed edifice of pride and manipulation. Collapse is not only psychological, it is archetypal. It is the inevitable reckoning when the mask that was meant to dazzle becomes too heavy to bear, and the soul behind it must confront the dark mirror of the unconscious. The narcissist, in truth, is the image of a fragmented soul, a being who has denied the wholeness of their own nature and thus has projected the unbearable burden of shadow onto those around them. But when the empath, long the silent vessel for this projection, finally awakens, when the empath ceases to carry the pain that is not theirs and returns the shadow to its rightful owner, the carefully guarded citadel of narcissistic illusion shatters, and in this shattering we see not merely an individual downfall, but the revelation of a psychological truth that cuts through the marrow of human experience. We must not think of the narcissist only in personal terms. The narcissist is an archetype, a figure woven into the collective unconscious. It is the mask of the king who rules without listening, the sorcerer who casts a spell but cannot endure his own reflection, the tyrant of myth who fears the prophecy of his downfall. Narcissism is a refusal to integrate shadow. It is the desperate attempt to sustain a godlike image in the face of a broken soul. But archetypes are not defeated through resistance alone. They are dissolved when light is brought to the unconscious, when the neglected fragments of the psyche return to their source. Thus the empath, who has long carried the burden of another's unconscious projections, becomes the unexpected alchemist, the unwitting priest of transformation. For to return the shadow is to force the narcissist into confrontation with what they fear most, themselves. But let us begin in the personal. Imagine the empath as a vessel, porous, open, sensitive to the currents of psychic life. Such individuals often mistake the suffering they absorb as their own, for they feel with such intensity that the boundary between self and other becomes translucent. And into this openness flows the unclaimed darkness of the narcissist. The narcissist, unable to face the abyss within, casts it outward, closing it in accusation, blame, seduction, and distortion. The empath, believing themselves to be a healer, receives this projection as though it were a sacred duty. In dreams, this dynamic often takes the form of a child carrying the burden of a wounded god, or of a vessel filled with poisoned water that nevertheless strives to quench another's thirst. The image is mythic because the dynamic itself is ancient. It is the dance of possession, the exchange of unconscious energies that leaves one inflated and the other depleted. The collapse begins not in the narcissist, but in the empath, for there comes a time when the burden grows too heavy, when the empath realizes the poison they have drunk is not their own. It often emerges as a dream of confrontation, perhaps the image of handing back an object that was never meant to be carried. I have seen such dreams countless times. A woman who dreams she is carrying a heavy bundle only to discover it belongs to a stranger. A man who dreams he is wearing a mask that does not fit his face. These images signal the birth of individuation, the moment when the unconscious begins to whisper, "Return what is not yours," And when the empath heeds this whisper, when they begin to see that the suffering they have carried was the shadow of another, they awaken a power they did not know they possessed. They no longer serve as the narcissist's mirror. They no longer accept the poisoned chalice. They simply return it. And in that moment, the narcissist's edifice collapses, for without projection, they are left naked before the abyss. Now, you must understand, collapse is terrifying for the narcissist because it is the destruction of the persona. The persona, that glittering mask, is the very foundation upon which they have built their identity. Without it, they are faced with the raw wound of their own insufficiency. To return the shadow is to strip away their defense, to reveal the truth that they have spent a lifetime fleeing. It is like pulling back the curtain on the wizard, revealing that the power was always an illusion. And so they rage, they crumble, they withdraw. They may attempt to seduce once more, to project with greater violence, to reassert their dominion. But the spell is broken. The empath, having awakened, no longer receives the projection. The alchemy has already occurred, and the narcissist, deprived of the mirror that once sustained them, faces the collapse of their carefully guarded kingdom. Yet this truth is not merely about the narcissist and the empath. It is about each of us, for within every soul lives both tendencies: the narcissistic refusal to see and the empathic openness that accepts too much. We are all susceptible to inflation, to the desire to live in a mask that denies the shadow, and we are all capable of carrying the burdens of others to the point of forgetting our own nature. The collapse of the narcissist is, therefore, an image of our own inevitable confrontation with the unconscious. The shadow must be faced, the projections must be withdrawn, and when this occurs, it feels like a collapse, a death, a shattering of the world as we knew it. But it is also the beginning of wholeness, for only in returning the shadow to its rightful place can the self emerge in its true form. In this light, the empath's awakening is not merely personal triumph, but a symbol of individuation. It is the recognition that to love truly is not to carry another's darkness as if it were your own, but to mirror it back so they might see it themselves. The empath becomes not the vessel of sacrifice, but the midwife of truth. And the narcissist, though they may rage, though they may fall, is given the only opportunity for salvation they will ever truly have. To see themselves, whether they seize this opportunity, is another matter. Many resist, many collapse into bitterness, denial, or despair. But some, a few, grasp the shadow and begin at last the work of transformation. And in that moment, what seemed a collapse is revealed as the possibility of rebirth. As I speak of this, I ask you to reflect upon your own life. Where have you carried shadows that were not yours? Where have you allowed yourself to become the vessel for another's unclaimed wounds? And where, perhaps, have you projected your own shadow onto those around you, expecting them to carry the unbearable weight of what you would not face? These questions are not meant to condemn, but to awaken, for individuation is not about perfection, nor about transcending the darkness. It is about integration. The collapse of the narcissist is, at its core, the collapse of the false self. And when that mask falls, whether in ourselves or in others, what emerges is not merely ruin, but the possibility of truth. The moment the empath ceases to absorb and begins to return the shadow is not a triumph of ego, but a quiet recognition of truth. It does not come with loud declarations, but with the silent force of inner clarity. This clarity is terrifying to the narcissist because it dissolves the enchantment. You see, projection depends on unconscious collusion. As long as the empath unconsciously agrees to hold what does not belong to them, the narcissist's illusion is sustained. But once the empath sees clearly, once they feel within their body the undeniable knowledge that the burden is alien, the entire psychic contract disintegrates. The narcissist collapses because their inner world was never stable to begin with. They were living on borrowed ground, feeding on the energy of another's light. And when that source refuses to give, the hollow within them opens like a chasm. We may look to dreams for the clearest symbols of this collapse. In one patient's dream, a grand palace stood gleaming, its windows adorned with gold. But when she pushed against one of the doors, the entire structure crumbled into dust, revealing that behind the facade there was only emptiness. The dream was not of a building, but of a person, a figure in her life who embodied the narcissistic mask. The palace symbolized the persona, magnificent, impressive, but hollow. When she ceased to support it with her own projection, it fell to ruin. Such dreams are not accidents. They are revelations of the psyche's deeper laws. That which is false cannot endure once the light of awareness touches it. The empath's role in this process is both painful and sacred, for to return the shadow requires courage. It requires the willingness to endure accusations, rage, perhaps abandonment. The narcissist, when confronted with their own darkness, will often strike with greater ferocity, for they believe their survival depends upon maintaining the mask. To hand back the shadow is to stand in the fire. It is to refuse the seduction of guilt and to declare without words, "This is not mine." And in that declaration lies the seed of individuation, for the empath learns the boundary between self and other, between authentic compassion and destructive enmeshment. This is not a rejection of the other, but an affirmation of the self. Only then can love become real. For real, love does not demand the sacrifice of one's soul. Do not think that the narcissist alone collapses. The empath too experiences a collapse, but it is of a different kind. It is the collapse of illusion, the collapse of the false identity of the Savior. The healer who believed their worth was measured by how much suffering they could carry. When the empath returns the shadow, they also return to themselves. They see, often for the first time, that their task is not to heal others by self-erasure, but to live authentically from their own center. And though this collapse is painful, it is also liberating. It is like the breaking of chains, the sudden breath of freedom after years in a narrow prison. The empath no longer confuses martyrdom with love. They begin to see that to bear the shadow of another is not compassion but complicity. True compassion mirrors. It does not absorb, it reveals. It does not conceal. Here, The archetypes of myth become instructive. Think of Persephone, taken into the underworld, forced to carry the darkness of Hades until she recognizes her role as queen of the shadow. Or of Psyche, who is given impossible tasks until she learns to see with the inner eye. The empath is such a figure, wandering into the underworld of projection until they discover that they hold the key to their own release, and when they return the shadow, they emerge not as the same innocent who entered, but as one who knows the mysteries of darkness. They become an initiate, tempered by the fire of psychic confrontation. For the narcissist, the collapse is both ruin and possibility. To have the shadow returned is to stand face to face with the wound they have denied. It is to see, often with unbearable clarity, the child within who was never loved, the terror of abandonment that gave rise to the mask. If they can bear this vision, if they can endure the pain without fleeing once more into illusion, then collapse becomes initiation. They may, at last, begin the work of integration, but if they cannot, they remain trapped in the cycle of projection, seeking new empaths to carry the burden they will not claim. Thus, collapse is both a judgment and a chance for redemption. It is the crossroads where fate demands a choice to descend into bitterness or to ascend into wholeness. Now let us widen the lens. This drama between narcissist and empath is not confined to individual relationships. It is enacted on the stage of culture, politics, even religion. Entire systems are built upon projection, upon the denial of collective shadow. Nations cast their darkness onto enemies. Religions project evil onto outsiders. Communities create scapegoats to bear what they cannot acknowledge within themselves. And just as in the personal, these structures collapse when the shadow is returned. History is filled with such collapses. Empires that fell when their illusions could no longer be sustained. Leaders who crumbled when the truth of their shadow emerged. To study psychology is to study history, for both are governed by the same archetypal laws. What is repressed will return. What is denied will surface. The shadow will always seek recognition, whether through the collapse of an individual or the upheaval of an entire civilization. You may ask, then, what is required of us who see? What is the task of those who awaken to this dynamic, who recognize both the narcissist within and the empath within, and who understand the sacred necessity of returning the shadow? It is the task of integration. To integrate means not to destroy the mask, but to recognize it for what it is, a persona, a tool, not the self. It means not to reject sensitivity, but to anchor it in boundaries, so that compassion does not become self-betrayal. It means, above all, to turn inward, to face the darkness that belongs to us, so that we do not unconsciously cast it upon another. Individuation is not the conquest of the shadow, but the marriage of opposites, the union of light and dark within a single soul. As I tell you this, I ask you again to reflect. Can you feel within yourself the mask you wear to protect your wound? Can you sense the places where you have allowed others to deposit their shadow within you? And can you imagine what it would be like to return it, not in cruelty, but in truth, in clarity, in the silent strength that says, I will not carry what is not mine. To do so is to step into your own life. It is to become an agent of transformation. both for yourself and perhaps for those around you. For when one person awakens, the spell begins to break for all. When you look into the face of the narcissist at the moment of collapse, you are not merely encountering an individual in distress. You are witnessing the psyche stripped bare, the archetypal drama of the shadow unmasked, the furious denial, the desperate attempt to reassert control. The sudden emptiness that follows these are not random behaviors, but the gestures of a soul confronting the abyss it has long denied. To collapse is to face what was hidden, and the narcissist fears this more than death, for it is a psychic death. It is dismemberment of the false self. And yet, within this death lies the seed of rebirth. For if the shadow is finally seen, if the wounded child at the center of the mask is acknowledged, then healing becomes possible. Without collapse, there is no transformation. The empath in this drama plays the role of mirror. It is through their refusal that the narcissist is finally forced to see. When the empath stops absorbing the projection, the narcissist is thrown back upon themselves. They encounter silence, where once there was acquiescence, resistance, where once there was submission. This silence is devastating, for it breaks the cycle of unconscious exchange. The narcissist cannot feed on what is no longer offered. They rage because the mirror no longer reflects their illusion, and in the emptiness they encounter their own forsaken self. Imagine a vampire deprived of blood, a sorcerer robbed of their spellbook. The collapse is archetypal, the hunger unsatisfied, the mask dissolved, and yet only here can truth enter. Only here can the wound, long denied, finally be seen. But you must understand, the empath is not immune to their own shadow. Their willingness to carry what is not theirs is itself a shadow dynamic, often born of early wounds, of childhoods where love was equated with sacrifice, where worth was earned through suffering. Thus, the collapse of the empath's illusion is as necessary as the collapse of the narcissist's mask. To awaken is to see that one's sensitivity, though a gift, has also been a prison. It is to recognize that compassion without boundaries is not love but compulsion. And in this recognition, the empath too collapses, not into despair, but into authenticity. They see at last that their task is not to redeem others by erasing themselves, but to stand in truth, to hold the mirror without losing their own reflection. In myth, this confrontation is symbolized by the hero who faces the monster, not by killing it, but by showing it its own face. Consider Perseus, who defeats Medusa by holding up a mirror. He does not strike blindly. He forces her to see herself, and in that reflection, she is undone. The empath, when awakened, becomes such a mirror. They do not destroy the narcissist, nor do they carry the darkness. They simply return it. And in that reflection lies the collapse, for the narcissist can no longer flee from their own gaze. This is why relationships with empaths are so dangerous to narcissists. The very sensitivity that once sustained the illusion becomes, in awakening, the sword of truth that pierces the mask. Let us not romanticize collapse. It is brutal, painful, often destructive. Friendships may end, marriages may shatter, families may fracture, the narcissist may spiral into rage or despair, the empath into grief or emptiness, yet out of this destruction, something new can be born. Individuation is never gentle. It requires the breaking of false identities, the dissolution of masks, the confrontation with wounds we have spent lifetimes avoiding. Collapse is not failure, it is initiation. It is the descent into the underworld, the dismemberment before rebirth. In alchemy, the nigredo, the blackening, is the first stage of transformation. The material must be broken down, dissolved into chaos before it can be purified and transmuted. Collapse is the nigredo of the psyche. Without it, there is no gold. In the collective unconscious, collapse manifests as the breakdown of illusions in society. We see it in the fall of empires, in the exposure of corruption, in the sudden revelation of truths long denied. Just as the narcissist cannot survive without projection, so too civilizations cannot endure when they refuse to acknowledge their shadow. The empath in this collective drama may be the prophet, the whistleblower, the artist, the mystic, those who return the shadow to the culture, forcing it to confront what it has repressed. And as with the individual, the collapse is both ruin and possibility. It is the chance for renewal, for a deeper wholeness, if the shadow can be integrated rather than denied. So we arrive at the central truth. The collapse of the narcissist is not an end, but a threshold. It is the breaking of the shell that allows the soul to emerge. But this emergence is not guaranteed. Many resist, clinging to the fragments of the mask, seeking new empaths to carry their burden. Yet some, a rare few, seize the opportunity. They see the child within, the abandoned self, and they begin the work of healing. They discover that what they sought in control and domination can only be found in integration. And for the empath, the collapse opens the door to authenticity, to a love no longer bound by compulsion, but rooted in truth. Ask yourself now, where in your life are you sustaining an illusion that must collapse? Where are you carrying shadows that are not yours? And where, perhaps, are you projecting your own darkness onto others, demanding they carry what belongs to you? These are not easy questions. They cut to the bone, but only by asking them do we move toward wholeness. The impulse awakening and the narcissist collapse are images of a deeper law. The psyche demands integration. What is denied will return. What is projected must be reclaimed. And though collapse feels like ruin, it is the gateway to transformation. The collapse of the narcissist, when seen through the lens of depth psychology, is never merely personal. It is cosmic. For what falls is not only an individual mask, but an entire constellation of illusions that the psyche has woven. This is why the event often feels catastrophic, why those who witness it describe the narcissist as if a god had been dethroned, as if a temple had suddenly crumbled. The persona they constructed was not a simple mask, it was an idol, a sacred edifice to protect the fragile child within. To watch it collapse is to witness an apocalypse of the soul, a revelation that the self they worshipped was never whole. And yet, as with every apocalypse, there is revelation. For the Greek root of the word means unveiling. The collapse unveils the truth long hidden beneath layers of denial. The empath, in this moment, stands as both witness and catalyst. The awakening is the silent hammer that cracks the idol. By ceasing to play the role of the carrier, they remove the fuel that sustained the narcissist's illusion. This is not done with violence, but with clarity. The empath says, not in words, but in presence, I return what is yours, and with this act, the unconscious mechanism of projection shatters. The narcissist is left alone with the abyss, and the abyss looks back. This is why the rage is so intense, the collapse so violent. They are not merely losing another person, they are losing the scaffolding that held their psychic world together. Dreams often speak of this collapse in images of broken mirrors, shattered crowns, ruined palaces. One man dreamed he was standing before a king whose robes turned to dust, whose crown melted into water. Another dreamed she held a mirror before a great beast. And when the beast saw its reflection, it fell into the earth. These are not just personal dreams, but archetypal visions, for the narcissist embodies the archetype of the false king, the ruler who governs not from truth, but from illusion. And every myth reminds us the false king must fall. For the true king to emerge, the collapse is not annihilation, but initiation. Though few recognize it as such in the moment, for the empath, the collapse is liberation. To return the shadow is to reclaim the self. It is to step out of the role of martyr and into the role of sovereign. No longer enslaved by guilt or compulsion, the empath begins to feel the contours of their own being. They realize that love does not mean carrying another's wound, but standing beside them as they face it. This realization is profoundly healing, for it dissolves the false belief that worth is earned through sacrifice. The empath learns that love and boundaries are not opposites but partners. To say no to what is not yours is to say yes to your soul. At this stage, the empath often undergoes dreams of release, images of handing back heavy bundles, of removing mask, of standing unclothed in light. These images signal a psychic rebirth, the emergence of authenticity. The empath no longer fears the collapse of the narcissist, for they know it is not theirs to prevent. They can watch the fall without feeling compelled to rescue, understanding that rescue would only prolong the illusion. This detachment is not cruelty, it is compassion in its highest form, for it honors both the other's shadow and one's own wholeness. But the narcissist, standing in the ruins, faces the most critical choice of their life. They may grasp at fragments, trying to rebuild the mask with new victims, seeking other empaths to carry the shadow. Or they may finally, in the stillness of collapse, turn inward. If they dare, they will encounter the child they abandoned, the wound they refused. This is a moment of unspeakable pain, for it is the confrontation with primal loss, the recognition of a love that was never received. Yet it is also the doorway to healing, to embrace that child, to feel the grief fully, is to begin the work of integration. Few take this path, but those who do are transformed. They move from illusion to authenticity, from domination to humility, from shadow to soul. The archetype of death and rebirth is at play here. The collapse is death. the end of the false self, but death, in the language of the psyche, is never the final word. It is the threshold through which new life enters. Just as the seed must crack for the plant to grow, the mask must shatter for the self to emerge. The narcissist collapse, if endured, can become a sacred passage, and the empath, freed from illusion, becomes the midwife of this passage. Though they cannot walk it for the other, they can only return what is not theirs and hold the mirror steady. This drama is also a collective one. Humanity itself is in such a moment of collapse. Our civilizations have long projected their shadows onto enemies, onto nature, onto the marginalized. We have built grand masks of progress, power, control, yet beneath them lies a wound unhealed. Our disconnection from soul, from the sacred, the collapse of systems, the unraveling of illusions, is the collective version of the narcissist's fall. And just as in the personal, the empathic souls among us are awakening, refusing to carry the projections of a broken culture, they are returning the shadow to the collective, forcing society to face itself. This is why the world trembles. We are watching not merely political or economic shifts, but the archetypal collapse of a mask too heavy to sustain. Yet in this trembling lies possibility, for collapse, though terrifying, is also grace. It strips away the false so that the true may be born. It humbles the inflated and liberates the enslaved. It calls us back to the forgotten child within, to the shadow we must embrace. This is the dark truth of Jung's psychology. The shadow cannot be escaped. It must be faced, integrated, returned, and only then can we move toward wholeness. So I ask you now, not as students, but as seekers, where are you still carrying what is not yours? Where have you confused love with sacrifice, compassion with absorption? And where, perhaps, do you still cling to masks, terrified of collapse, unwilling to face the child within? The empath and the narcissist are not only roles we play with others, they are forces within us. Each of us must awaken the empath who learns to return the shadow. Each of us must endure the collapse of the narcissist within, that false ruler who would rather control than feel, and in doing so, each of us moves closer to the self, that center of wholeness which embraces both light and shadow. The collapse, though feared, is the silent ally of the soul. Without it, we would cling forever to illusions, mistaking masks for faces and roles for essence. The narcissist resists because collapse feels like annihilation, the very erasure of their existence. Yet what is annihilated is not the true self, but the idol erected in its place. When that idol crumbles, the ground of being is revealed. It is not the end of life, but the beginning of real life. For authenticity cannot blossom while we are enthralled by false gods. The empath, too, has their collapse not as loud, not as destructive, but no less profound. It is the collapse of the savior fantasy, the dissolution of the lie that their value lies in carrying what does not belong to them. They grieve, they rage, they weep, but finally they breathe. For the first time, they are free to live as themselves. Think of this as a sacred rhythm. The narcissist collapses outwardly in rage, in despair, in implosion. The empath collapses inwardly in recognition, in grief, in surrender. Both collapses are invitations. Both demand that the mask be set aside. Both point toward individuation, the path of the self. And in this rhythm, we find the eternal pattern of death and rebirth, of descent and ascent, of shadow and light entwined. The psyche, left to its own devices, will always bring us here, for the unconscious has but one aim: wholeness. It will strip away every illusion, tear down every false edifice, until we are left with the raw material of the soul. Only then can we begin the alchemy of integration. Consider the myths. Osiris dismembered, only to be reassembled into a god of resurrection. Christ crucified, only to rise transformed. Inanna descending to the underworld, stripped of every garment, until she stands naked before death itself. These are not stories of the past, they are mirrors of the psyche. The collapse of the narcissist is Osiris torn apart, the persona scattered. The awakening of the empath is Inanna rising, transformed by the stripping away. Together they enact the same truth, that destruction is the precondition of transformation. The shadow must be returned, the mask must fall, the illusions must die, or else the soul remains trapped in its prison. I tell you this because you will face collapse, whether in yourself or in those around you. Perhaps you already have, perhaps you are in the midst of it now. And though every instinct urges you to flee, to rebuild the mask, to cling to what is familiar, I urge you instead to remain in the ruins, remain in the silence. Do not rush to restore the idol, for idols will only fall again. Instead, listen. Beneath the rubble, you will hear a voice, the voice of the forgotten child, the forsaken self, the seed of authenticity waiting to grow. This voice is faint at first, drowned by rage or sorrow. But if you stay, it will strengthen. It will lead you not back to illusion, but forward to integration. It will show you that collapse is not the end, but the opening. And what of love? For it is love that binds the empath to the narcissist, love that keeps the projections alive. Love, too, must collapse, not the eternal essence of love, but the false form it has taken, the love that is compulsion, the love that is self-erasure, the love that confuses sacrifice with salvation. This false love must die, so that true love may be born. True love does not carry another's shadow, but invites them to face it. True love does not erase the self, but affirms it, even as it embraces the other. True love holds the mirror steady, not out of cruelty, but out of reverence for truth. It is fierce, it is boundaried, it is whole. When the empath awakens, they discover this love, and though it may mean the end of certain relationships, it is the beginning of life-giving connections rooted in authenticity. I must also speak of the shadow within each of us. It is easy to see the narcissist outside, to point to their collapse and their illusions, but each of us carries a fragment of that archetype, Each of us wears masks, projects darkness, resists collapse, and each of us carries within a piece of the empath the compulsion to absorb, the fear of saying no, the longing to save. The real work is not to identify villains and victims outside, but to see these figures within. Where are you still wearing the crown of the false king? Where are you still drinking the poison of another's shadow? Where are you still avoiding the collapse that must come? These questions are not meant to shame, but to awaken, for only in seeing them can we begin the journey of individuation. Do not be afraid of collapse. It is the necessary death before rebirth. When you feel the ground falling beneath you, when the mask slips, when the illusions disintegrate, remember that this is the path every soul must walk. You are not being punished, you are being initiated. The darkness that rises is not here to destroy you, but to be integrated, to be embraced, to be made part of the whole. The narcissist collapses because they cannot hold the mask. The empath collapses because they cannot hold the burden, and you collapse because you cannot remain divided. Wholeness demands it. The self demands it. Collapse is the hand of the self, sweeping away what no longer serves. So I leave you with this truth. The narcissist collapses when the empath returns the shadow, but in this collapse lies the seed of transformation. What looks like ruin is in fact the beginning. What feels like death is the birth of wholeness. Do not fear the ruins, build upon them. Do not fear the silence, listen within it. Do not fear the shadow, embrace it, for it belongs to you. And as you walk through collapse, you will find that the self, the eternal, the whole, the true was waiting all along.